This is Another Brought Gifts by Bess Aldrich. The story of old Jed Miller is a story straight out of the horse and bug, no, cutter days. It is as old-fashioned as the dripping tallow candles on Christmas trees in the 80s, and as sentimental as a candy heart. The telling of it brings forth the memory of a combination of old odors, the delectable ones of molasses, taffy, and fresh popcorn balls, the pungent ones of Norway pine branches and burning wax, the stuffy ones of the atmosphere in a small-town church on Christmas Eve. For Jed Miller and Christmas Eve were synonymous terms in those years. Old Jed Miller was one of the humblest of the early inhabitants of that small inland town, hewn there out of the forest on a midwestern river's bank. Old Jed, everyone had called him from his earliest days in the village, although he must have been rather young when he arrived, with neither funds nor friends. Because of his weather-beaten countenance, he looked old while he was still young, and because no deep worries or family responsibilities possessed him, he appeared not very much different when he had grown old. Old Jed Miller, the ageless. He lived alone in a little unpainted house at the edge of the town back there in the days of its building. Maple Street ran up to the boundary line of his yard and then stopped suddenly, as though realizing there was little use to continue on past so unpretentious a place. Indeed, there had been little need for the street to come even that far, for old Jed's callers were few. A fellow townsman to get him to cut cordwood, schoolboys wanting hickory sticks for some potential hockey game, an occasional book peddler from whom old Jed bought no book, but whom he more than likely asked to stay and eat. As the town grew and the cordwood was largely gone, with all the stumps in Main Street out of the way so that lumber wagons and high-topped buggies might safely roll along its dusty thoroughfare, old Jed's occupation gradually changed. It grew to be that in the springtime, women all over town waited for Jed to come and spade the lettuce beds or beat the carpets thrown across the clothesline in the prairie wind. In the midsummer, when the arguing with various husbands over the weeds growth in the alleys brought no immediate results, the housewives sent determinedly for Jed to bring his scythe and mow. In the fall, scarce a storm window went into place that was not guided by Jed's calloused hands. "I'm going to have Jed the first of the week," any woman might say. "I've already spoken for him," a mother might respond. So old Jed became as definitely town property as the new waterworks standpipe, or the little meadow which had been stylishly termed the park since the building of the bandstand. Although busy from the time the sun came up behind the trees at the river's bend until it slipped over the prairie's rim, Jed's weekly earnings were small. A dime for this job, a quarter for this one, whatever the woman chose to pay him. That was Jed's income. Because he could have done nothing else well, they seemed to think such modest jobs as the filling of straw bed tick or the planting of onion sets should be done almost gratuitously. But he managed to get along in his own way and save a little toward that possible rainy day when the housewives might suddenly discontinue his services. All this was on weekdays. Sunday was, as Jed himself might have expressed it, a horse of another stripe. On the Sabbath, old Jed Miller dressed up and became a prominent citizen. In the first of that early period, with the town but a new settlement and the church a modest frame, Jed's part in the Sunday services consisted in sitting behind the organ and pumping wind into the lungs of its cloth anatomy. His work was wholly voluntary. No one thought of paying him anything for it. In truth, those days no one thought of paying anything for church work except for the infinitesimal salary to the minister augmented by donations of coffee, sugar, and molasses from the pound socials. If one had anything faintly approaching a singing voice, one donated one's musical output to the choir. If one could keep books in which exceedingly small sums of money were debited and credited, one occasionally and gratuitously became the treasurer. If one had a good flexible muscle in his right arm, as did Jed, one volunteered turning cranks. In time, because of the sticking of the old organ's keys and the threatened collapse of a lung, when even Jed's muscular right arm could no longer coax wind into its asthmatic interior, it was put aside and a modest pipe organ installed. With no questioning of church authorities and without benefit of appointment, at the first practice for dedication, Jed Miller, with greased hair and in a new blue suit, arrived to disappear importantly behind a wing of the new organ and began another decade of pumping. When the organist took her seat and the Gloria rolled forth, a member of the choir who could see Jed from where she sat, that his face shone with the apparent joy of being an accessory to the melodious notes. Perhaps it did something to Jed. It may be that in his simplicity of thought he gave the woman at the keys very little credit for the music, felt that it was he alone who caused the notes to pour forth on wings of song. From that time he voluntarily added much of the care of the organ and the entire church to his services. All this constituted the whole life of the quiet little man, a mere uninteresting existence of one who knew neither deep sorrow nor tumultuous joy, who would never experience either the ice or the fire of living. If once a week, for a time, he felt real happiness, it was a mere ripple of pleasure by the side of a great tidal wave of excitement that overwhelmed him once a year. This was the high point of Jed's existence. Towards this hour was all else pointed. For this one exultant moment did he live, Christmas Eve at the church. In those years of the 80s and 90s, Santa Claus was a single entity, an individual upon whom one could count specifically in regard to time and place. You heard his bells, and he arrived through the side door of the church onto the pulpit, frost-laden and breathless. He bade you farewell and disappeared through the same door. You heard his bell die away in the distance, and knew he was gone for an interminable year. He did not walk the streets advertising toothpaste or barbecued sandwiches or basketball games in the Coliseum, several good seats left at 35 cents. There is one and only one Santa. In that town he was old Jed Miller, but of course you did not know that for many years. You went to the church on that night of nights, clothed in several layers of flannels, a dress coat, muffler, knitted hood, mittens, and overshoes. Wedged between equally well-equipped adults, you rode with them in the cutter, your short feet not quite reaching the warm soapstone, your mouth and nose filled with snow-laden air and buffalo hairs. Even as you turned the corner near the church, you saw the lights shining through the colored glass windows out over the snow, and in sickening sensation of fear, wondered if you had missed one moment of the rapture. Although practically nothing could have tempted the fat old mare to bulge from the spot, you had to wait while she tethered to the rail between the hitching posts. When, at last, over crunching snow you went up the steps, your muscles twitching, your mouth dry, almost were you ill in this pit of the stomach. At the doorway you gazed upon paradise, with a swooning of senses at the sight. Resuscitated after that first shock, they became as acute as a bird dog's. For the eyes there were a great Norway pine sparkling against the white of the wall, packages on it and under it, the shining pipes of the new organ beside it reaching up into heaven. For the ears, the rustling of papers or angels' wings. It was hard to tell which, and the voices of the congregation singing "Joy to the World." For the nose, odors of cinnamon and peppermint, fresh popcorn and cooked molasses, crushed balsam and burning wax. In due time there followed a program to which you did or did not personally contribute, depending largely on the timely question of whether you were in a state of health or had just passed. Mumps, measles, chickenpox, whooping cough, or the shingles. But whether or not you donated your services, the pieces spoken were practically all known to you, being largely a repetition of those that had been perpetrated the year before and many years before that. There was the perennial, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse, and one which had been handed down from year to year, but which you had never satisfactorily translated, sounding as it did like lattice in they clabbered, lattice in they say. The program happily over, you saw old Jed Miller go behind the pipe organ again, heard the music of an old hymn, which all would sing, sensed on the verge of a nervous breakdown that after its 7 verses it was finally dying away into silence. And then a stillness vast and limitless, save for a hysterical giggle or two. This was the moment supreme. This the one toward which all the other moments of all the hours of the year were directed, so vital that the illness came again in the pit of your stomach, and your arms and legs twitched in an ecstasy of emotion. There were bells tinkling faintly and far away, then closer, bringing every tingling hair root to life. Fascinated, you could not take your eyes from the side door, so that when it shook a little, you shook too. He never missed. How could he time himself so definitely to the program's end? The bells jangled now with mad, breathtaking closeness. The door opened. He bounced in merrily, short and round, with a round little, you know, the word you ought not to say out loud, that shook like a bowl full of jelly. The children roared their welcome, all but you. You hid your face for a moment because of the world-shaking event that was taking place. He called Merry Christmas, children, many times, and said that Pikeville was one of the places he liked best of all to come. He told what a hard time he had getting here and how the reindeer were stamping outside, impatient for him to hurry. Then he sauntered over to the tree and said, well, well, he guessed he'd better begin to call the names on the packages. Thereupon he handed them out with such intimate comments that it was unbelievable how he could know so much town gossip. When you went up for yours, he said something so personal that you realized anew how uncanny was his knowledge of your everyday life. Sometimes he called the boys by family nicknames, which you would scarcely have expected him to know, Tweet or Tubby or Babe, so that everyone in the audience laughed. Yes, he knew every one. Here's something for Tommy Graham. Hi, Tommy. What's this I hear ye again? You hitching on the back of Schmidt's grocery cart? Have you been? Yes, sir. You won't know more? No, sir. The audience roared and red-eared. Tommy received his gift. He knew all, heard all, saw all. This Santa who stopped here en route to other towns. Sometimes, when the exercises were nearly over, a swaggering older youth whispered across to you, Ho, ho, you think that's a real Santa Claus, don't you? Well, it ain't. It's old Jed Miller dressed up that-a-way. Questioned, your parents had the retort supreme for you. Didn't you see old Jed Miller go behind the organ to pump and never come out? It was true. You admitted to the fact of seeing old man Miller disappear into the cavernous depths behind the organ, and because you were unaware that a panel in the sturdy oak wall slipped out of place if one knew where to locate its sensitive spot, you admitted, readily enough, that Santa Claus came in while old man Miller was still behind there. Sometimes they added still another proof. Wasn't Santa Claus fat, and isn't old man Miller thin as a willow whistle? It silenced you, so that you were convinced for another year, and no hulking boy with bragging tongue could shake your faith. The thing that gave you the most confidence in the fabulous wealth and generosity of Little Man in Red was the fact that when the gifts had all been handed out, he called the boys and girls to the platform, that is, all who had not reached their 10th birthday. Unbelievably, he gave each one money, 30, 40, 50, even 60 boys and girls. He gave them all a shining quarter. He had done so for years. He had one ruling. Every child must walk up to the tree by himself. No babies in arms and no holding parents' hands. There were those who thought the Pikeville babies learned to walk earlier on account of the Santa Claus quarter. It was traditional. All the presents out, Santa walked to the edge of the platform and held up his hand for silence. The older people in the audience laughed and nudged one another. It's his big moment, and just lives for it. You might hear, but not understand. Now I want all the boys and girls who can walk up here by themselves, and is under 10, every one to come up again. He patted the big pockets of his scarlet coat and called out something in his commanding voice. I've got a little something else for each one of you. The rush to the Klondike then began. Santa Claus held up his hand for silence. I've watched all the children of this here town, and I says to myself, says I, they're pretty good, young'uns. I guess I give every one some money. There was lusty shouting, so that he held up his hand again. If you were very close, you saw how worn and calloused it was, like a hand that worked in gardens, and you wondered why. Before I go back to my home. Where you live? A boy perennially asked. Oh, up beyond Iceland or Greenland, summers in the Arctics. There's 3 things I want you should always remember. Live upright lives, do some good in the world with this here money I give you, and always keep the Christmas spirit in your hearts. And when you get older, bring all the happiness you can to other little children at Christmas time. Do you promise? Oh, yes, sir. All right, then. Here goes. Shining quarters, 1 for each child. Again, he knew about all the children. Johnny Quinn, you got your last one a year ago. You were 10 in July. Oh, my goodness, think of him knowing that. You clutched your quarter tightly and went back to the pew where your parents sat grinning. Look, he gave me money. Well, well. You clutched it all the way home. This different money that came from Iceland or Greenland or the Arctics, but was strangely the same kind of silver money your parents possessed on rare occasions. If you dropped it in the snow, you bawled to the moon and held up the whole congregation on the steps until it was retrieved. Santa had told you to do good with your money. Sometimes you gave it the very next Sunday to the Sunday school, so that you might rid yourself of all further responsibility and the ethics of its disposal. Sometimes, After due meditation, in which you were torn between moral rectitude and the flesh pots, you sent it to the missionaries via the Ladies' Society with the righteous satisfaction of having converted countless heathens. Sometimes, human nature having been quite the same in the not always so gay 90s, you bought huge white gum hearts and licorice with them, waiting conscious smitten for bad luck to follow, immeasurably relieved when it failed to appear. Always, the little man ended with the same pronouncement which he gave like the benediction. Remember, live upright lives, do something good with your money, always keep the Christmas spirit in your hearts, and try to make other children happy. Ah, well, you were not always upright. You did not always do good with your money, but perhaps, mellowed a little by the benediction of long ago, you did resurrect the Christmas spirit each year. Then suddenly you were 10, and had passed the traditional quarter gift age. Too soon knew the disillusioning truth. Santa Claus was Old Man Miller. It was disappointing, but after the shock of the discovery was over, you joined the conspirators. Because you had so loved the great moment, you too kept silent and saw the other little children of the town walk up excitedly for their money. Then after a time, when you were much older, you saw something else, the drama and the pathos that were Old Man Miller. You saw how all year, old Jed Miller lived for this 1 hour of giving. It seemed foolish, saving from his small wages to give it away in one reckless hour of abandon. Don Quixote mowing lawns. Pikeville called it plain dumb. And then the old man grew feeble, and rather forgetful, but still he gave much of his time to the church. Although it must have been harder for him, he annoyed some of the people, particularly the Reverend Julius Parkinson, who had come from a larger place. For before the services, old Jed would squeak about the church, fussily passing out extra hymn books, getting down on his knees to hunt for a child's lost penny. The membership was changing. There were more important people in it now. Mrs. Albert Tobin, for instance, who was both a pillar and a power. She and the Reverend Parkinson agreed between them that the services would possess more dignity without the preliminary squeaking of old Jed. He is an institution, a few old-timers protested. He's a nuisance, Mrs. Tobin retorted. So a new and younger man was asked to care for the church and surprisingly given a small wage for doing so. You may tell an old family dog that he is no longer a member of the family, but it means practically nothing to him. With this same pleasant scope of vision, old Jed chose to look upon the newcomer as a mere assistant and went about his faithful, if squeaking, way. And then Christmas was coming. Mrs. Tobin was to have charge of the exercises, and she explained to Jed that they were dispensing with his services behind the organ and simultaneously with his Santa Claus impersonation. I won't have him spoiling my program with his crude ways and illiterate speech, she announced. The time had come to tell him so in plain words. There could be no mistaking the plainness of Mrs. Tobin's words. She told Jed they were to have a pageant this year, a beautiful, moving, artistic pageant. There would be Joseph and Mary and the Christ child, shepherds and wise men and angels. Children would represent hope and courage, fear and selflessness, truth and service, love and faith. In fact, every perfection and every frailty attendant upon humans was to be represented in Miss Tobin's artistic pageant. Everything, in short, except a fat Santa Claus in a disreputable old red suit and dirty white whiskers. She told the other ladies that she thought for once old Jed had got it through his head. And she was quite right. Old Jed got it through his head. All the life went out of him. He disappeared from the church and from his old haunts. When it occurred to someone that he had not been seen around much, Dr. Waters went down to the unpainted house at the end of Maple Street. He found old Jed in bed. Told questioners uptown that he guessed the old man was about done for. He left him medicine, told him to keep quiet, and promised to drop in again. Christmas Eve came with the lights from the church streaming out on the snow, and the Norway pine growing and sparkling against the white wall. Everyone had to give Mrs. Tobin credit for her pageant. It was more artistic than the old pieces, spoken in hodgepodge order. There was a nice dignity about the whole program, with the aura of spiritual significance. As Miss Tobin had so aptly predicted, the wise men and the shepherds, truth and service, hope and love, were letter perfect. The angels sang their final song and the pageant was over. When bells sounded loudly at the side door, Miss Tobin looked startled, and every child drew in an excited breath. Door opened, and into the midst of the artistry and the spiritual significance bounced a little old Santa Claus, in a disreputable red suit and dirty white whiskers. Every child let out its breath in one wild shout. Every parent said, "Of all things," or "thought he was sick." Dr. Waters half rose from his seat and sat down again. Miss Tobin gave a very good imitation of a lady smiling when eating a lemon. Bet you thought I might not get here, but here I be." He might have swayed a little. The dignified pageant turned into a riot, noisy and hilarious. Santa gave out the presents, calling names with gusto and adding personal comments to every excited child who came for them. "Now I got something for everybody here, under 10. He slapped his heavy pockets. "I've been watching the children o'er this town, and I says they pretty good. So I looks all around my house." "Where is it?" called the perennially bold one. "Oh, I ain't tellin'. Summers on Iceland or Greenland or the Arctics." There was a quarter for each one, as there had been for over 30 years. It was just as the silver shower ended that it happened. A little flame suddenly darted up from a dipping candle on the tree, curled as its yellow-red tongue around the branch leaped into the next one. Women screamed, men jumped to their feet, children stood fascinated with horror, watching the little red tongues crackle toward the upper branches. And then the little old Santa sprang to it, grasping the flaming thing in both arms, wrenched it from its sand-filled keg, and kicking open the side door, went out with this torch-like burden. Dr. Waters hurried after the old man. A dozen adults followed. They brought him in from the snow to the side room of the church. Dr. Waters said it was not the burns, that the old man should have never left his bed. Must have been mighty hard for him to get dressed and come here. There was scarcely a dry eye in the little room filled with grown people. It was not just that old Jed was dying. It was that the memory of those Christmas Eves when they had been little, so it seemed that youth and childish happiness were going out with him now. "Those 3 things," he roused himself, thinking they were children there around him. "Live upright lives, do good with this here money, always keep the Christmas spirit, and make other children happy. Do you promise?" "We promise." Outside, people were grouped around the door, children clutching quarters, pestered their parents with questions. "What's happening to Santa? Did he get hurt?" "No, nothing can happen to Santa." "Well, who's that in there, then?" "That's old Jed Miller." "Well, what's going to happen to him?" "He's going away." "Where?" "Oh, up. Maybe up beyond the Arctics." Afterward, recalling how little work he had been able to do that year, everyone realized how he must have skimped himself to save for that last Christmas. Telling it after many years, the whole thing sounds too sentimental for this practical age. Such an outmoded tale about old Jed Miller giving away his hard-earned money to the children, as old-fashioned as that one about the men who long ago brought another child gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Thank you for listening to Another Brought Gifts. If you want to learn more about Mrs. Aldrich, visit bessstreeteraldrich.org.